Hello. Welcome back. If you are watching these videos, it means that you have moved on to more advanced topics in policy debate. Today, we're going to be talking about the negative block, which is an incredibly important part of any debate round. It is the only chance where one team gets back-to-back speeches. In other words, the negative has 13 minutes straight to make arguments that the affirmative will have to respond to in 5 minutes in the 1AR. So let's talk about our goals for the negative block. Foremost among them is to create multiple ways that the negative can win. Because once the negative block is over, the next speech the negative gives will be its last, the second negative rebuttal. So in order to make that speech successful and to give yourself multiple ways to win the debate, you have to be thinking what arguments are going to make it through the negative block. If you're a little bit confused what I mean by make it through, check out our video on kicking arguments. If you remember back from some of the earlier videos, we talked about how debate is a funnel. The negative should be condensing down to its best arguments, but that doesn't mean only one argument. It means its best strategies to win the game of debate, and then select one and go for it in the final rebuttal. The second goal is to make the 1AR's job as hard as you possibly can make it. You have a unique tactical opportunity in the block. Again, you have 13 minutes to make arguments, and the affirmative only has 5 minutes of speech time to respond to them. So if you make enough arguments in enough different areas, it will make it difficult for the 1AR to present effective arguments in response to all of them and to cover all of the ground, leaving potentially some unanswered arguments or unanswered strategies or undercovered arguments and strategies that you can exploit in the final rebuttal. So let's talk about the techniques to make the block the most effective that it possibly can be. I break these down into two categories: off-case techniques and on-case techniques. We'll start with off-case techniques. If you remember, off-case refers to arguments like disadvantages, topicality, counterplans, and critiques. Those are all off-case positions. And the technique we're about to walk through applies to each and every one of those. So if you are extending or explaining and arguing an off-case position in the negative block, you always start with an overview. An overview, if you've watched our video on overviews, is a summary of the argument. It doesn't have to be more than 15 or 20 seconds, but it's important to remind most judges in a very simple way about what the total argument, whether it's a disadvantage or a counterplan, really is. Because as a practical matter, by the time the second negative constructive or the first negative rebuttal rolls around, there will have been 1 to 2 cross-examinations and 1 or 2 speeches since the judge really last thought about an off-case position from the negative's perspective. So it's a good way to remind the judge, make sure they're on the same page, and be persuasive about the basics of the argument. After you have summarized the negative off-case position, your job is then to go and answer every single affirmative argument. We call this the line by line because you are going argument by argument or line by line on the flow. And if you need to figure out what line by line or flowing means, check out our videos on those. There are 3 things that you should be doing to attack each affirmative argument. The first is you should be utilizing the first negative constructive evidence to respond to affirmative arguments. Most of the time, the affirmative will attack the parts of a disadvantage, or the parts of a counterplan, or the parts of topicality. Presumably, if you have made an effective off-case position, you will have read evidence to support most parts of a negative argument. Few exceptions here and there. But let's stick with the disadvantage as an example. You'll have read uniqueness evidence, link evidence, and impact evidence. So if the affirmative says, actually, we think the uniqueness is different, your 1NC evidence should answer that. You then should attack the quality of the affirmative evidence. Maybe the author is unqualified. Maybe the evidence lacks a warrant. Maybe the evidence is old. or maybe the evidence is assuming something that your argument doesn't actually address, or maybe their evidence is just totally off topic and doesn't actually respond to your argument. But you need to attack your opponent's arguments. Great debaters are great because they have the ability to compare and contrast the arguments that are going on. So attack the affirmative evidence. Finally, read additional evidence to support the particular issue that you're addressing. So if the affirmative has challenged your link evidence and you have extended and explained and applied the 1NC link evidence, you've attacked the quality of the affirmative evidence, go ahead and read another piece of link evidence, time permitting, of course. But if you do that, you have created 3 layers of arguments for the 1AR to deal with for just about every single affirmative position. That's really hard to deal with. And the final part of the off-case technique is if your negative off-case argument has an impact, like a disadvantage, topicality, or even a critique, you need to do what we call impact analysis. And impact analysis is comparing the impact argument from the negative position to the affirmative case and giving the judge a way to compare those and decide which one is worse, which one is faster, which one is bigger, or, for example, if the impact to the disadvantage actually makes the problems that the affirmative has identified worse. So there's a lot of different things we could call those, but you need to be doing the comparison on one or multiple of those levels that I just talked about. Let's talk about our on-case technique. This on-case technique applies to whatever part of the affirmative case that you're talking about, whether it's solvency, an advantage, or inherency. The first thing that you should do is summarize the various reasons you think that part of the affirmative case is weak. This is a little bit different than an overview for an off-case position because you're not taking a whole cohesive argument and summarizing it for the judge. Instead, most of the time when we attack the case, there's various reasons why it won't work. But you need to kind of give a very high-level example of the solvency flaws of a case, for example. Once you've done that, you need to extend each 1NC argument that you want to extend. Let's say you've made 3 of them and you want to extend all 3, then you need to go and extend each one individually. So what do we mean by extend? Extending an argument means you go to that particular argument, you explain the what and the why. The why is critically important for 2 reasons. First, you need to explain the warrant of the piece of evidence or the argument, and you need to explain why the argument matters. What does it mean if you win that argument for the affirmative case? Once you've done that, answer whatever the affirmative has said. The 2AC should respond to those arguments. And if they have, then you need to answer those. That gives you the opportunity to not only reapply the 1NC evidence, but you can read additional supporting evidence for that particular position. And then finally, if time allows, you can read additional evidence to attack and support the positions for a particular set of arguments on the case. Now, you can't make brand new arguments, for example, if you're in the rebuttal stage, but you can read additional evidence to support and make the same or similar arguments from the block. Tips for success. How do I do this well? How do I take those techniques that I just talked about and apply them consistently? First, write blocks. Write explanations of your uniqueness, link, and impact evidence for a disadvantage. Have with those explanations additional evidence to support your arguments or that you can read against an opponent. If you've debated an opponent before, take the arguments they made in response to an off-case position or even to an on-case position and write responses. Prepared debaters are better than debaters that are trying to make it up on the fly. So pre-write those arguments, pressure test them, revise them. That will make you more successful. Split the block. This is essential. The 2NC and the 1NR should each take different arguments. Again, we talked about making the 1AR's life difficult and making it so you have multiple strategies. The most effective way to do that is to make sure that whatever the 2NC talks about, the 1NR talks about something different. And that means that you don't have repetitive arguments or overlap that take that 13 minutes of argument and really make it only, say, 7 or 10. Instead, you want that full 13. Similar to blocking out arguments, pre-write overviews. Write those out. You know what those arguments are ahead of time, so write out your summaries. Pick strategies ahead of time. You should be sensing a theme here about doing things in advance. Before a round, before the block, before a tournament, you can sit down with your partner and figure out against a particular affirmative or type of affirmative what the strategies you think are best. We will talk about this at practice, and this is something I can help with. But you should go into a round not just throwing things against the wall and figuring out what sticks. Instead, you should go in there thinking, this is our A strategy, this is our B strategy, this is our C strategy. Think about the game of debate and how you're going to play it long before you walk into the round. Finally, be flexible. Exploit the weaknesses that might come out of the 2AC. For example, the 2AC might undercover a particular position. Well, that represents an opportunity that you should exploit. Maybe the 2AC made contradictory arguments. Utilize those to your advantage. Maybe the 2AC spent a ton of time on what you thought was your A strategy, and as a result, your B strategy looks more effective to exploit. So go for your B strategy. But be aware of what the 2AC does. Don't be locked into the preparation you've done ahead of time. The preparation you do ahead of time is to enable you to be flexible, adaptive, and knowledgeable in the round to most effectively exploit the block.